The readings were in English. Back in the 40s, as I remember it, prior to Vatican II, the gospel would be read in Latin by the priest, and then the first thing in the pulpit would be to read it again in English, so he could preach about the gospel. People didn't understand what was being read when he was reading the Latin, and so they had to repeat it. That was good. Then when there was the business of the people were being empowered, it was the church were the people of God, is when the documents of the Vatican Council said. And so the people were encouraged to participate. Parish councils were encouraged to be established. Finance committees were required. And suddenly it wasn't just the Holy Name Society and the Women's Club and breakfasts and lunches and fashion shows. It was people getting involved in the business of the parish and having some say. Well, of course that created great turmoil, because there were lots of people who saw that as their opportunity to run the church and straighten everything out. There were priests who had spent their whole life trained and working at being responsible to make the decisions and run the church. And they were feeling threatened because their parishioners now wanted to tell them how to do the job they were trained to do, and the parishioners weren't trained. So there was lots of problems and turmoil in there. It was a growing time, but it was a painful growing time, as most are. I can remember it was Phil Erlander, I believe, and a lot of people remember Phil that were around in those days. You knew Phil if you were in Incarnation. And his son, Father Mike Erlander, is still a priest of the Archdiocese. And Phil was the guy who I think called the first meeting, and he invited maybe half a dozen men, no women, just men, because only men had a position of leadership in the church in those days. And we gathered and talked about it, and we all talked about what we knew nothing about. And except that Phil knew, he had read a little more than the rest of us, and he knew what was coming better than us. And he talked about forming this committee to be a consulting group for the priest. Well, it didn't take long for parish council concepts to become, we're the board, instead of we're here to bounce ideas off of you and for you to bounce ideas off of us, and together find what we can do to improve our parish and its programs. And so that was a difficult time. And Phil was announced to be the parish administrator. It was the first time, certainly an Incarnation had been heard of, and probably I never knew of another parish that had it at that point. And he was announced to do that, and he retired from Honeywell early on Friday before Memorial Day weekend. And on Memorial Day, he had a heart attack and died, so he never actually worked the job. And he lived 2 doors over from me on 40th and Harriet, and we saw the turmoil. The ambulance came, and I went over there, and when they were carrying him out, and he was talking to me, and he seemed fine. And that afternoon, his son, Father Mike, who was there across the yards, I said, "How's your dad doing?" He said he was fine. He's going to be okay. And the next morning, I found out that he had died that night. So he was just a great strength in the parish. Very gentle and caring and inclusive. He couldn't invite enough people into his world to help him do the things that he saw needing to be done, and they were all positive things. We lost a whole lot when we lost Phil. Father Adrian and I have talked sometimes in more recent years about those years, because Father Adrian was the pastor, the associate first, and then the pastor in that time frame when we were storming before we were norming, as a parish council and a school board and that kind of stuff. And Father Adrian gives a perspective from being the priest and and very much willing to adapt to the changes in the church, but finding it very difficult to do it with people wanting to just take his job, not to help him do his job. So that was a very trying time, but we survived all that, and the church prospered, and the schools stayed full for quite a while. I remember being president of the school board in I would guess early to mid-60s. It was about the time when the curriculum was changing, the religious curriculum. There was this need to get rid of the Baltimore Catechism, and it isn't so much the Baltimore Catechism being bad, but it was about the method of teaching, of memorizing questions and answers. And if you memorize them all, now you know your faith. And people were pushing for more in-depth religious education. But they threw out the old before they had the new, and there was turmoil in the school. Why aren't you teaching my children their religion anymore? Because the teachers were not teaching the Baltimore Catechism. And they really had a difficult time exploring and finding good curriculums. It took some years for good curriculums to be developed to replace it. And so it was a tough time, but I remember we had a meeting in the auditorium one year when I was chairman of the school board, and me and the pastor and the principal, and just trying to explain what was happening, that the church was in a time of change, and that we really don't know what the end product's going to look like, but we're teaching your children their faith. And I remember one woman standing up and saying, and we kept using the word Christian, teaching them their Christian faith. And this woman stood up and said, we don't send our kids to Incarnation to be taught to be Christians, we send them to be taught to be Catholics. And it could either make you very angry, she was angry, or it could make you laugh, or it could begin to show us, and maybe looking backwards 30 years or more, it show us the reality of the turmoil. Parents did send their kids to the Catholic school, and sister taught them. And whatever sister taught them, that was right. And if the kids questioned it, the parents backed the nuns. And now they're not teaching them that stuff, and what they are teaching them is stuff the parents never heard and learned. And so the parents needed to be re-educated too. And so I can understand the frustration. I'm talking to Father Jim DeBranker today and about that issue, and I said, I grew up thinking Christians were Protestants and we were Roman Catholics, and there were two very distinct groups. And now all of a sudden the church emphasizes that we are a Christian-based church. We didn't know where we were, and it's taken time for us to come to understand that. But understand the turmoil and understand that we come to the new reality of what we are. So it was in the hindsight, it was a wonderful time. At the time, it was a very painful time. New kinds of ministry. We weren't doing youth ministry the way we used to do youth ministry in the 60s, and there was turmoil over that. And we had one priest who became the lightning rod, and people rose up against him, and others rose up in support of him, and we have terrible tension for a little while here in the parish. And it resolved itself in time. And we still have good priests, and we still have good kids and good religious ed for them. So it all comes out, but it took some time.